The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the cobblestone streets of the bustling medieval city. Merchants shouted their wares, children darted between carts, and the scent of freshly baked bread mingled with the sharp tang of iron from nearby blacksmiths. Amidst this chaos, a grand procession moved like a river of gold and crimson through the heart of the city. The royal family, seated atop ornate carriages draped in silk, was flanked by rows of stern-faced royal guards clad in polished armor. Their rifles gleamed menacingly under the fading sunlight, a stark reminder of the power they wielded. Elias stood at the edge of the crowd, his calloused hands gripping the hem of his worn tunic. He had traveled for days to reach the city, leaving behind his barren fields and crumbling hut. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, but it wasn't just food he sought, it was justice. His village, once thriving, now lay in ruins, its wells dry, its crops withered, and its people broken. The king's taxes had drained them dry, while rumors whispered that the nobles feasted nightly on roasted pheasants and imported wines. Elias clenched his fists as anger boiled within him. Today, he would make his voice heard. As the procession approached, the crowd surged forward, eager to catch a glimpse of the monarch. Elias hesitated, unsure if he should step closer or retreat altogether. Then something snapped inside him. Pushing past startled onlookers, he stumbled into the open street, directly in front of one of the towering guards. Time seemed to slow as the guard turned toward him, raising a gleaming rifle with practiced ease. Panic gripped Elias, but so did determination. This moment might be his only chance. With a cry that startled even himself, Elias lunged forward, grabbing hold of the rifle with both hands. The guard staggered slightly, caught off guard by the unexpected resistance. Gasps rippled through the crowd as heads whipped around to witness the scene unfolding before them. "Please," Elias shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "You don't understand. My people are starving. We need help." The guard, a broad-shouldered man named Aldrich, narrowed his eyes. His grip tightened on the weapon as he tried to wrest it free from Elias's grasp. But Elias clung on with every ounce of strength he possessed, his knuckles white and his breathing ragged. Tears streamed down his face as he screamed again. "We have nothing left. Nothing." For a moment, there was silence. Even the horses pulling the royal carriage seemed to pause, their hooves hovering mid-step. The tension was palpable, stretching tighter than a bowstring. Would the guard strike him down? Would the crowd intervene? Or would someone else step forward to decide Elias's fate? Aldrich's expression remained unreadable, though his jaw tightened ever so slightly. He could feel the weight of dozens of eyes watching him, waiting to see what he would do next. Deep down, however, Elias's raw emotion stirred something unfamiliar within him, a flicker of doubt about the very system he had sworn to protect. Elias's life had always been a struggle, but even he hadn't imagined it would lead him to this moment. Clinging to the rifle of a royal guard, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest, his hands trembled as Aldrich finally yanked the weapon free, leaving Elias stumbling backward onto the cobblestones. The crowd murmured nervously, unsure whether to cheer, flee, or simply watch. For Elias, however, there was no escape now. He sat there, breathing heavily, his eyes wide with fear and defiance. The guards quickly surrounded him, their rifles pointed menacingly. Aldrich stepped forward, towering over the young farmer. "Who are you?" he demanded, his deep voice cutting through the noise of the crowd. Elias swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I'm nobody," he stammered. Just a man trying to survive." His words were met with silence, but his gaze never wavered. Slowly, he pushed himself to his feet, brushing dirt from his tattered clothes. Despite his disheveled appearance, there was a fire in his eyes that caught Aldrich off guard. Elias began to speak, not out of defiance, but out of desperation. "My name is Elias," he said, his voice growing steadier. "I come from a village far from here, a place where the soil is cracked, the rivers have dried up, and children cry because they haven't eaten in days. Every year, your king takes more from us than we can give. We pay taxes we can't afford, and still, nothing changes. My parents died working themselves to the bone for scraps, while your nobles feast on riches we'll never see." His words hung heavy in the air. Some in the crowd nodded sympathetically, others shifted uncomfortably, and a few even muttered curses under their breath about the unfairness of it all. But for Aldrich, something stirred deep inside. He had spent years enforcing the crown's laws without question, believing it was his duty. Yet hearing Elias's story made him pause. Was this truly justice, or was it oppression masked as order? Before Aldrich could respond, the royal carriage came to a halt nearby. A servant hurried forward, opening the door to reveal the king himself, an imposing figure with a golden crown perched atop his head. Behind him stood the queen, her expression softer, almost sorrowful as she gazed at Elias. The king's voice boomed across the square. "What is the meaning of this disturbance?" Aldrich straightened, snapping back into his role as a loyal guard. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing slightly. "This man disrupted the procession and attempted to seize my weapon. He claims to represent villagers suffering under our rule." The king frowned, clearly unimpressed. "Then arrest him," he ordered curtly. "Such insolence cannot be tolerated." But before anyone could act, the queen stepped forward, her voice gentle yet firm. "Wait," she said, silencing the king with a glance. She approached Elias, studying him with kind eyes. "You say your people are starving?" she asked softly. Elias nodded, tears welling up again. "Yes, Your Highness. We've begged for help, but no one listens. I came here today, hoping someone would care enough to hear us." The queen exchanged a glance with the king, who sighed deeply. Clearly irritated, he waved a hand dismissively. "Do what you will with him," then he muttered, retreating into the carriage. The queen, however, remained. After a moment of thought, she turned to Aldrich. "Take him to the palace. Let us hear his full account." As Elias was led away, confusion swirled in his mind. Had he just sealed his fate, or sparked something greater? Meanwhile, Aldrich couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter might challenge everything he believed in. The grand halls of the palace were unlike anything Elias had ever seen. Golden chandeliers hung from high ceilings, their light reflecting off polished marble floors. Tapestries depicting battles and coronations adorned the walls, and the air carried the faint scent of lavender and beeswax candles. To Elias, it felt like stepping into another world, one so far removed from the dusty fields and crumbling huts he called home that it might as well have been a dream. He was led to a large chamber where the queen sat on an ornate chair, her posture regal yet approachable. Around her stood advisors in fine robes, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright disdain. Aldrich stood nearby, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, watching silently as Elias shuffled forward. Despite the opulence surrounding him, Elias couldn't help but feel small and out of place. His tattered clothes and dirt-streaked hands seemed even more conspicuous here than they had in the streets. The queen leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady. "Tell us your story," she said gently. "Leave nothing out." Elias took a deep breath, his heart pounding. He began with the drought that had struck his village 2 years ago, a relentless sun that scorched the earth until the rivers ran dry. "At first, we thought it would pass," he explained, his voice trembling at times but growing stronger as he spoke. "We prayed for rain, worked longer hours, and rationed what little food we had. But then came the taxes." His fists clenched involuntarily. Every month, soldiers arrived demanding more gold, more grain, more livestock. We gave them everything we could, but it was never enough. He described how his father had collapsed one day while repairing a broken well, too weak from hunger to continue. How his mother had sold her wedding ring to buy medicine that ultimately did nothing. And how, eventually, both parents succumbed to illness, leaving Elias alone to care for his younger siblings. "I buried them with my own hands," he said, his voice cracking. "And when I went to the Lord's estate to beg for help, They turned me away. They said if I couldn't pay my debts, I didn't deserve mercy. By the time Elias finished speaking, the room was eerily silent. Some of the advisors shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact, while others whispered amongst themselves. The queen, however, remained still, her expression thoughtful. Finally, she spoke. You say this is not an isolated case, that other villages suffer similarly. Elias nodded vigorously. Yes, Your Highness. It's happening everywhere, especially in the outer regions. People are losing hope. Some are even talking about rebellion. He hesitated before adding, if something doesn't change soon, there will be bloodshed. The queen exchanged a glance with one of her senior advisors, a stern-looking man with silver hair. What do you propose we do? The advisor asked sharply, addressing Elias. Do you expect the crown to simply forgive your debts and shower you with riches? No, Elias replied firmly, surprising even himself with his composure. All I ask is fairness. Lower the taxes, send aid to those who need it most, and let the people have a voice. Right now, we're treated like tools to be used, not human beings. The room fell silent again as the weight of his words sank in. The queen tapped her fingers lightly on the armrest of her chair, considering. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she turned to Aldrich. Captain, she said, her tone decisive, this man will stay within the palace grounds until further notice. Assign him quarters and ensure he is fed. We will discuss his claims and possible solutions at tomorrow's council meeting. Aldrich bowed stiffly, though his brow furrowed slightly. The idea of housing a peasant in the palace was unconventional, to say the least. Still, he followed orders without question, gesturing for Elias to follow him. As they walked through the corridors, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking a tightrope. One misstep, and he could fall into ruin, or perhaps rise higher than he'd ever imagined. The next few days were a whirlwind for Elias. He was given a small but comfortable room in the palace, far more luxurious than anything he had ever known. The bed was soft, the sheets clean, and there was even a window that overlooked the sprawling gardens below. Servants brought him meals 3 times a day, warm bread, hearty stews, and fresh fruits he hadn't tasted in years. Yet, despite the comfort, Elias couldn't relax. Every time he looked at the gilded walls or heard the faint sound of laughter from the royal court, guilt gnawed at him. His village was still starving, and here he was, living like one of the very people he had accused of ignoring their plight. Aldrich visited him regularly, though their interactions were awkward at first. The captain wasn't used to speaking with peasants, let alone treating them as equals. But over time, something shifted. Aldrich began asking questions, not just about Elias's village, but about his life before all this. What made you leave your home? He asked during one visit, his tone softer than usual. Elias hesitated before answering. I didn't have a choice, he admitted. My siblings are staying with neighbors now, but they can't take care of them forever. I hoped someone here would listen. If no one did, I didn't know what else to do. Aldrich nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. For a man who had spent his entire life following orders without question, hearing Elias's story challenged everything he believed about duty and loyalty. You're braver than most, Aldrich said finally, surprising both himself and Elias. Not many would risk their lives the way you did. Despite the growing respect between them, Elias knew his fate still hung in the balance. Each morning, he attended meetings with the queen and her council, where heated debates raged about how to address the issues he had raised. Some advisors dismissed his claims outright, insisting that rebellious peasants simply needed to be punished. Others argued that lowering taxes or sending aid would weaken the kingdom's economy. The queen listened intently, her face calm but her eyes sharp as she weighed each argument. One evening, after a particularly tense meeting, Aldrich approached Elias outside the council chamber. They're not going to agree easily, he said bluntly. Change doesn't come quickly in places like this. I know, Elias replied, frustration creeping into his voice. But if we don't try, nothing will ever improve. People are dying out there, Aldrich. Dying because they've been forgotten. Aldrich studied him for a moment, then sighed. Maybe there's another way, he suggested cautiously. If the council won't act, perhaps we can find a solution ourselves. Something small, to start with. What do you mean? Elias asked, intrigued. There are supplies stored in the barracks. Food, blankets, tools. Things meant for emergencies. If we could sneak some out and get it to your village. Aldrich trailed off, realizing the implications of what he was suggesting. Helping a peasant smuggle goods wasn't exactly within his job description. Elias stared at him, stunned. You'd really do that? Risk getting in trouble? Aldrich shrugged, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. It's better than doing nothing. Besides, he added with a faint smirk, you've already dragged me into enough trouble as it is. Over the next few days, they worked together in secret. Aldrich used his authority to arrange transport, while Elias wrote letters to trusted friends in his village, instructing them on how to distribute the supplies fairly. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And for the first time since arriving at the palace, Elias felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps change was possible, not through grand gestures or sweeping reforms, but through small acts of courage and kindness. As they prepared for the final stage of their plan, Elias realized something important. Aldrich wasn't just a guard anymore. He was becoming an ally, a friend, and together, they might just spark something bigger than either of them could have imagined. The first shipment of supplies reached Elias's village under the cover of darkness, a wagon laden with sacks of grain, bundles of warm blankets, and sturdy farming tools rolled into the desolate settlement just as the moon hung high in the sky. The villagers, who had grown accustomed to despair, gathered around in stunned silence. At first, they thought it was a trick or some cruel prank by passing merchants. But when Elias stepped out from behind the wagon, his face illuminated by the flickering torchlight, gasps of disbelief rippled through the crowd. It's him, someone whispered. Elias is back. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, cautiously, people began to approach. Mothers clutched their children closer, while elders leaned on canes, their eyes wide with hope and suspicion. Elias raised his hands to quiet them. This isn't much, he said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. But it's a start. These supplies are for everyone. Share them fairly, and don't lose heart. Help is coming, I promise. Tears streamed down faces as the villagers embraced him, thanking him over and over. For the first time in years, there was laughter amidst the ruins. That night, fires were lit and simple meals were shared. It wasn't much, just porridge made from the donated grain, but it tasted sweeter than anything they'd had in months. Word spread quickly to neighboring villages, and soon whispers of Elias's name carried like a breeze across the countryside. Back at the palace, however, tension simmered beneath the surface. Aldrich had managed to secure the supplies without raising too many eyebrows, but rumors were beginning to circulate among the guards. Questions arose about why certain stockpiles seemed lighter than usual. One evening, as Aldrich patrolled the barracks, a junior guard approached him hesitantly. "Sir," the young man began, shifting uncomfortably, "some of us have noticed. Well, things seem different lately. Supplies missing, orders changing unexpectedly." Aldrich cut him off with a sharp glance. "Mind your post, soldier," he said firmly. "If you see something amiss, report it properly. Until then, focus on your duties." But the encounter left Aldrich uneasy. He knew they couldn't keep this up forever. Sooner or later, someone would piece together what was happening. Worse still, Elias had begun receiving letters from other villages pleading for help. Each note described worsening conditions, crops failing, wells drying up, families fleeing their homes in search of work that didn't exist. The weight of it all pressed heavily on both men, forcing them to confront an uncomfortable truth. Their small acts of kindness weren't enough. One night, sitting in the dim light of a lantern in Elias's quarters, Aldrich voiced his growing concern. "We're treading dangerous ground," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "If we push too far, too fast, we'll be caught. And if we stop now, everything we've done will mean nothing." Elias nodded grimly. "I know," he replied. "But stopping isn't an option. Not when so many lives depend on us." He paused, staring at the pile of letters scattered across the table. "Maybe it's time we stopped working in secret. What if we found others who feel the same way? People inside the palace, outside the palace, anyone willing to fight for change." Aldrich frowned, considering the idea. It was risky, almost reckless. Yet deep down, he knew Elias was right. Change wouldn't come from staying silent. They needed allies, people brave enough to stand against the system, even if it meant risking everything. Over the next few weeks, they began quietly reaching out. Aldrich spoke to trusted comrades within the royal guard, testing their loyalty and gauging their willingness to help. Elias, meanwhile, sent coded messages to sympathetic villagers, encouraging them to organize and share resources. Slowly, tentatively, a network began to form, a fragile web of resistance spanning both ends of the kingdom. It wasn't rebellion, not yet, but it was the seed of something greater, something that could grow into a movement capable of challenging the very foundations of power. As Elias and Aldrich worked tirelessly behind the scenes, they realized they were no longer just two men fighting for survival. They were leaders, united by a shared vision of justice, and ready to risk everything to make it a reality. The fragile network Elias and Aldrich had built began to grow faster than either of them had anticipated. Villagers, emboldened by the first shipment of supplies, started organizing themselves into small groups. They shared food, repaired broken wells, and even pooled their meager resources to buy tools for farming. Word spread from village to village, carried by travelers and merchants who whispered about a new hope rising in the countryside. Meanwhile, within the palace walls, Aldrich's trusted comrades among the royal guard quietly passed along information, details about troop movements, supply shipments, and council meetings that could be used to aid the cause. But as their efforts gained momentum, so did the risks. One fateful morning, disaster struck. A young guard named Thomas, one of Aldrich's closest allies, was overheard discussing plans to divert another shipment of supplies. The conversation reached the ears of Lord Cedric, a cunning and ruthless advisor to the king known for his paranoia and greed. Suspicious, Cedric ordered an immediate investigation into the missing stockpiles. Within days, Thomas was arrested, tortured into confessing everything he knew, including the names of those involved. When news of Thomas's betrayal reached Elias and Aldrich, panic set in. "They'll come for us next," Aldrich said grimly, pacing back and forth in Elias's quarters. His usual calm demeanor had vanished, replaced by raw fear. "If they find out what we've done." Elias clenched his fists, trying to stay composed. "Then we act now," he interrupted. "We can't wait any longer. If we're going to be caught anyway, let's make sure it's not for nothing." Aldrich hesitated but nodded reluctantly. Together, they devised a desperate plan. Using coded messages, they alerted the villagers to prepare for a mass protest, a march toward the capital to demand justice. At the same time, Aldrich rallied his remaining allies in the royal guard, urging them to protect the protesters rather than suppress them. It was a gamble, one that could cost them their lives. But there was no turning back. The day of the march arrived under a gray, overcast sky. Hundreds of peasants gathered on the outskirts of the city, carrying banners made from scraps of cloth and makeshift signs bearing slogans like "Fairness Now" and "No More Hunger." Their voices echoed through the streets as they advanced, growing louder with each step. Inside the palace, chaos erupted. The king raged at his advisors, demanding action, while the queen pleaded for restraint. Troops were dispatched to block the roads leading to the palace, but many of the guards, swayed by Aldrich's influence, refused to follow orders. As the crowd neared the gates, tension reached its breaking point. Archers lined the walls, arrows drawn, while soldiers stood ready to charge. Aldrich positioned himself between the two sides, his heart pounding as he raised his hand in a gesture of peace. "Hold your fire," he shouted, his voice cutting through the commotion. "These people are not your enemies. They are your brothers and sisters, starving because of laws you enforce without question." For a moment, silence fell. Then, unexpectedly, some of the guards lowered their weapons. Inspired by Aldrich's courage, others followed suit. Seeing this, the crowd surged forward, flooding the courtyard. The king appeared on the balcony, his face red with fury. But before he could speak, the queen stepped forward, her voice ringing out clear and strong. "Enough," she declared. "This ends today." Her words stunned everyone, including Elias, who stood at the front of the crowd. The queen turned to her husband, imploring him to see reason. Reluctantly, the king agreed to meet with a delegation of villagers, led by Elias. It was a small victory, but it marked the beginning of something greater, proof that unity and determination could challenge even the most powerful systems. Yet the battle was far from over. As night fell, Elias and Aldrich met secretly once more. Though they had achieved a temporary reprieve, they both knew the road ahead would be fraught with danger. But for now, they allowed themselves a brief moment of hope. Change was possible, and they were determined to see it through, no matter the cost. The meeting between the villagers and the king was tense but transformative. Under the queen's watchful eye, Elias stood before the monarch, his hands trembling not from fear, but from the weight of representing thousands of desperate lives. He spoke plainly, painting a vivid picture of their struggles. Empty fields, dry wells, and children crying themselves to sleep with hollow stomachs. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice firm despite his nerves, "we don't ask for charity or special treatment. We only want fairness. Lower the taxes, send aid to those who need it most, and give us a chance to rebuild." For once, the king listened, not because he cared deeply, but because the sheer scale of unrest had shaken him. The march on the palace had revealed how close his kingdom was to collapse. With the queen's quiet urging, he agreed to implement immediate reforms, reduced taxes for struggling regions, emergency food shipments, and plans to repair neglected infrastructure. It wasn't everything Elias had hoped for, but it was a start. Word of the agreement spread like wildfire across the kingdom. Villages celebrated cautiously, knowing that promises could easily be broken. But Elias and Aldrich knew better than to rest. They understood that true change required vigilance, and that there were still powerful enemies lurking in the shadows. Lord Cedric, humiliated by the uprising, seethed with resentment. He began secretly rallying other nobles, planting seeds of distrust against the queen and her newfound sympathy for the peasants. To him, this movement was nothing more than rebellion disguised as reform. Elias and Aldrich worked tirelessly to strengthen their network. Peasants continued organizing into groups, pooling resources, and sharing skills. Some even formed militias to defend their villages from bandits or retaliatory attacks by vengeful lords. Meanwhile, Aldrich trained trusted members of the royal guard, teaching them tactics to protect civilians without resorting to violence. Slowly, an unlikely alliance emerged. A patchwork army of farmers, laborers, and disillusioned soldiers united by a common cause. But tensions boiled over when rumors reached Lord Cedric about another protest brewing in the capital. Determined to crush dissent, he orchestrated a brutal crackdown. Soldiers loyal to him stormed several villages, burning homes and arresting leaders. News of the atrocities ignited outrage, pushing Elias and Aldrich to take drastic action. They called for a massive demonstration outside the city gates, demanding accountability and justice. Thousands answered the call, flooding the streets with banners and chants of defiance. On the day of the protest, chaos erupted. Lord Cedric's forces clashed with the crowd, sparking panic. Arrows flew, smoke filled the air, and screams echoed through the square. Amidst the turmoil, Aldrich led a group of guards to shield unarmed protesters, forming a human barrier between them and the advancing troops. Elias, too, refused to back down, standing atop a cart to rally the people. "We are stronger together," he shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. "They can't silence all of us." As the confrontation escalated, the queen intervened once again, riding out on horseback to separate the two sides. Her presence stunned everyone into silence. She addressed both the protesters and the soldiers, appealing for calm and promising swift punishment for those responsible for the violence. Lord Cedric watched from the palace balcony, his face pale with fury, but powerless to act. That night, Elias and Aldrich met in secret, exhausted but resolute. Though they had survived another day, they knew the fight was far from over. The road ahead would be fraught with danger, betrayal, and sacrifice. Yet, as they looked out at the flickering torches of the encamped protesters, they felt a glimmer of hope. Change was no longer just a dream. It was becoming a reality. And though the cost might be high, they were ready to pay it. Together. The days that followed the protest were a blur of tension and transformation. The Queen, true to her word, took swift action against Lord Cedric and his allies. Evidence of their cruelty, burned villages, confiscated grain stores, and lists of names marked for arrest, was presented before the king. Even he could no longer ignore the corruption festering within his own court. With a heavy sigh, he stripped Cedric of his title and banished him from the kingdom, sending a clear message that such abuses of power would no longer be tolerated. But the victory was bittersweet. The scars left by Cedric's brutality ran deep, and many villagers still mourned loved ones lost in the crackdown. Elias traveled tirelessly, visiting affected communities to offer comfort and ensure supplies reached those in need. He carried with him not just food and tools, but also stories of resilience, reminders that they had stood together and fought back against oppression. Slowly, hope began to take root once more. Aldrich, too, found himself changed by everything that had happened. Once a loyal enforcer of the crown, he now saw his role differently. Together with Elias, he worked to reshape the royal guard into something more than an instrument of fear. Training sessions focused not only on combat, but also on protecting the vulnerable and upholding justice. Many guards embraced this new purpose, while others quietly resigned, unwilling to adapt. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Months passed, and the kingdom began to heal. Fields that had lain fallow for years were tilled anew, wells were dug deeper, and markets buzzed with activity as trade routes reopened. The Queen established councils in every region, giving peasants and laborers a voice in decisions that affected their lives. Taxes were lowered, and aid flowed steadily to struggling areas. For the first time in generations, people dared to dream of a better future. Elias returned to his village, though it barely resembled the desolate place he had left behind. Neighbors greeted him warmly, their faces fuller, their spirits lighter. Children laughed as they chased each other through fields lush with crops. Standing atop a hill overlooking the land, Elias felt a swell of pride and gratitude. None of this would have been possible without Aldrich's courage, the Queen's compassion, or the countless unnamed heroes who had joined the cause. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Aldrich arrived at Elias's doorstep. "I thought I'd find you here," he said with a small smile, holding out a flask of wine. They sat together under the stars, talking about everything they had endured and all they had achieved. "You know," Aldrich mused after a long silence, "when I first met you, screaming and clinging to my rifle, I never imagined we'd end up here." Elias chuckled softly. "Neither did I. But maybe that's how change always starts, with someone desperate enough to try something impossible." They clinked their cups together, savoring the moment. Though neither man knew what challenges lay ahead, they were certain of one thing. The kingdom was stronger because of what they had done. And as long as people remembered the power of unity and determination, the seeds of justice would continue to grow. In the distance, the sound of laughter drifted through the night, a reminder that even in the darkest times, light could prevail. Elias glanced at Aldrich, then back at the thriving village below. Together, they had sparked a revolution, not with swords or bloodshed, but with hope, courage, and unwavering belief in a brighter tomorrow.